Now showing an ancient spellbook for the dead. An exhibition at the Getty reveals the Egyptian Book of the Dead, long relegated to a dark vault in the light of day. In the mid-19th century, a British antiquarian named Sir Thomas Phillips announced his intention of owning one copy of every book in the world. A professed velomaniac, Mr. Phillips, a quarrelsome baronet, bought manuscripts indiscriminately from booksellers with whom he engaged in ceaseless battle. Soon there was hardly room in his mouldering Cotswolds mansion for his second wife, Elizabeth, who eventually moved to a boarding house in Torquay, an English working-class seaside resort. By the time Mr. Phillips died in 1872, he had amassed an unparalleled collection of 60,000 documents and 50,000 printed books. His descendants auctioned off his private library bit by bit, and by the late 1970s his collection of 19 ancient funerary scroll fragments, each a part of what is today collectively known as the Egyptian Book of the Dead, was acquired by the New York book dealer Hans P. Krauss. Together with his wife, Hanny, Mr. Krauss donated the lot to the J. Paul Getty Museum in Los Angeles in 1983. For the last 4 decades, the writings, which span a period from around 1450 BC to 100 BC, have been stowed in a vault, fragile and easily damaged by light. On November 1, an exhibition at the Getty will present 7 of the most representative pieces to the public for the first time. The show will run until Jan. 29. Rita Lucarelli, an Egyptologist at the University of California, Berkeley, said, "I am glad that the Getty finally decided to disclose and exhibit what has been until now an almost forgotten part of its glorious collection of antiquities, but that contains in fact important specimens of one of the most famous ancient Egyptian corpus in the world. You only live twice." A standard component in Egyptian elite burials, the Book of the Dead was not a book in the modern sense of the term but a compendium of some 200 ritual spells and prayers, with instructions on how the deceased's spirit should recite them in the hereafter. Sarah Cole, the curator of the Getty exhibition, called the incantations a kind of supernatural travel insurance designed to empower and safeguard the departed on the long, tortuous journey through the afterlife. Unlike today's insurance policies, no 2 copies were the same. Despite the book's title, it was life rather than the afterlife that preoccupied ancient Egyptians, who lived for 35 years on average. "Your happiness weighs more happily than the life to come," reads one inscription from the New Kingdom period, which lasted from 1550 BC to 1069 BC. "The texts are a means to assuage your mortal anxiety and control your destiny," said Foy Scalf, an Egyptologist at the University of Chicago and the editor of the exhibition catalog. Indeed, the original name for the text translates to the Book of Coming Forth by Day. In 1842 the German scholar Karl Richard Lepsius published a translation of a manuscript and coined the name Book of the Dead, Das Totenbuch, which reflected long-standing fantasies about the nature and character of Egyptian civilization. The numbering system he used to identify the various spells is still used today and figures prominently on the Getty's exhibition panels. Compiled and refined over millenniums since about 1550 BC, the Book of the Dead provided a sort of visual map that allowed the newly disembodied soul to navigate the do-it maze-like netherworld of caverns, hills and burning lakes. Each spell was intended for a specific situation that the dead might encounter along the way. For instance, spell 33 was used to ward off snakes, which had an unsettling taste for chewing the bones of a putrid cat. Without the right spells, you could be decapitated. Spell 43, placed onto a slaughter block. Spell 50, or, perhaps most humiliating of all, turned upside down. Spell 51, which would reverse your digestive functions and cause you to consume your own waste. Spells 52 and 53. In a hellscape primed with booby traps and populated by some of antiquity's most fearful imaginings, magic mattered. Among the spookier illustrations on display at the Getty are depictions of gods, the jackal-headed Anubis, the falcon-headed Horus, and monsters, Amit the Devourer, a crocodile-headed hybrid of a lion and a hippopotamus. The reason that the creatures are terrifying is not to scare souls trying to access these places but to keep out those who don't belong there. Dr. Scalf said, "Entering in among the gods is a very restricted thing. The intended destination was the realm of the gods and the safe haven of eternal paradise, a field of gently waving reeds that resembled an idealized version of the Egypt that the deceased had left behind. The lush landscape had field hands who helped each arrival sow, plow and harvest the grain that supplied sustenance for the gods. Not only are the dead worshipping and feeding the gods, but worshipping and feeding their deceased ancestors and even themselves." Dr. Scalf said, "This isn't servitude, this is pious work that shows your piety toward the gods." Having attained divinity, the deceased joined the sun god Re as he traversed the sky in a solar boat. At sunset, they crossed in the west and merged with Osiris, god of the netherworld, and assumed regenerative powers. Near dawn, Re would fight the giant serpent Apep, lord of chaos, and emerge victorious in the east to complete an endless cycle of renewal and rebirth. Scrolling at the Getty. Ownership of the Book of the Dead was largely limited to nobility, priests, courtiers and other patrons who could afford the extravagance. Individuals of high status would commission a scribble workshop to produce a customized selection of spells that mentioned them by name. 2 of the 4 papyrus scrolls in the Getty show belonged to women named Aset and Enkhseneset, both of whom were priestesses and ritual singers of Amun at the god's temple in the Karnak complex of Thebes. The scrolls are tattered scraps, having been removed from tombs during an unregulated age of European colonialism and altered for the art market. The oldest roll of papyrus in the Getty collection was the property of a woman named Weben Esra and includes spell 149, in which the deceased encounters 14 mounds in the netherworld, each with its own inhabitants. Spells were inscribed on nearly every available space in burials. Dr. Scalf said, "Some were painted on the interior and exterior of sarcophagi, others were imprinted on shrouds, statuettes, amulets and magical bricks embedded in the walls of tombs." Another of the exhibition's highlights are 3 thin linen strips that were inked with spells and then wrapped around mummified bodies as part of the ritual embalming process. The bandages brought the sacred texts in direct physical contact with the deceased, enveloping and protecting them. Dr. Cole, the show's curator, said, "That made the relationship of people to the Book of the Dead even more personal." Once part of longer textiles applied to the cadavers of 2 men named Pet Osiris, the wrappings were torn off during the 19th century and sold in pieces. The bodies themselves may have been pulverized and sold as paint pigment, mummy brown, or medicine, mummia, a powder found on apothecary shelves throughout Europe. Grateful Dead. The show's coup d'etat is a papyrus rendering of the Hall of Judgment made for Peshwashikut, a doorkeeper who served the moon god Khonsu at Karnak. The vignette detail shows an episode from spell 125, in which the deceased appears before Osiris and a tribunal of gods while his heart, believed to be the site of the intellect, is weighed by Anubis, keeper of the kingdom of the dead. On one side of the scale is the heart. On the other, the feather of the goddess Maat, the embodiment of truth and justice. If Peshwashikut's heart equals the weight of the feather, he will be admitted into the next world. If the heart is too heavy, meaning his sins outweigh his good deeds, the crouching, open-mouthed Amit the Devourer will consume and consign him to a second, and lasting, death. In the accompanying hieroglyphics, Thoth, the ibis-headed god of writing, announces the result. His heart is safe upon the scale without fault found. Peshwashikut has passed the test. It is time to join Re and climb aboard the solar boat. There is a spell for that too. The Book of the Dead is a modern-day name given to a series of ancient Egyptian texts that the Egyptians believed would help the dead navigate the underworld, as well as serving other purposes. Copies of these texts were sometimes buried with the dead. The Book of the Dead denotes the relatively large corpus of mortuary texts that were typically copied onto papyrus scrolls and deposited in burials of the New Kingdom circa 1550 BC to 1070 BC. wrote Peter Dorman, Professor Emeritus of Egyptology at the University of Chicago, in an article published in the Book of the Dead. Becoming God in Ancient Egypt, Oriental Institute Museum Publications, 2017. The Book of the Dead became popular during the New Kingdom, but it was derived from the coffin texts, so named because they were often written on coffins, and the pyramid texts that were inscribed on the walls of pyramids, Dorman noted. The coffin texts were popular during the Middle Kingdom, circa 2030 BC to 1640 BC. While the pyramid texts first appeared in the Old Kingdom's 5th dynasty, circa 2465 BC to 2323 BC. The Book of the Dead includes individual chapters or spells. The ancient Egyptians used the word ar to designate each composition. The word ar is generally translated as spell or utterance. It is written with the hieroglyph of a human mouth because the term was related to speech voice Galf, the head of research archives at the